The fourth way cosmology explains what we call the universe as the ray of creation. And the idea is that there may be many rays of creation in the larger universe, but in particular, the fourth way looks at our ray of creation, like a branch on a tree. So our branch in the universe comprises the entire branch, which is depicted here by the circle on the outside. And the fourth way terminology for that is the absolute. So that means the absolute of this ray, everything within this ray as a whole, that's the absolute. And that's called World 1. World 3, which would be inside of it, would be all the worlds comprising the absolute. And you can think of that as all of the galaxies in our, let's say, neighboring universe, our universe, of which there may be many, remember. World 6 would then be all the suns in those galaxies, but in this case it would refer specifically to our galaxy. So now we're at the level of our galaxy, and that would be World 6 in the cosmology of the fourth way. World 12 would be our sun. World 24 would be all of the planets in our solar system. World 48 would be the Earth, and that would include both the physical Earth as we know it and organic life on Earth, the thin film of organic life on Earth, which includes the animal, vegetable, mineral, and human kingdoms. And then finally, at the end of the ray of creation would be World 96, or in this case the Moon, which is a planetary orb around our Earth, which the fourth way views as an embryonic planet. So it views the Moon as very much orbiting the Earth. It's in the womb of the Earth, and it's tethered to the Earth as an embryo is tethered to its mother in the womb. The idea is that the Moon would eventually grow and become a planet. It would begin to revolve on its own axis, which it doesn't do presently. There's a lot more information about this, but to summarize what we're looking at here, the idea is that in the ray of creation, according to the fourth way cosmology, it's a system of worlds within worlds within worlds. And each world is influenced by all the worlds above it or surrounding it. And this is just another way of looking at that same diagram we were just looking at. Here, some additional triangles have been added to indicate more this idea of worlds within worlds, and that lower worlds are influenced by higher worlds. And the arrows pointing to World 48, which is the Earth within the ray of creation, to show this is where we reside as human beings inside of our ray of creation. And the principle in the fourth way cosmology is that this means, given where we're located, that we're subject to many influences, all coming from all the way from World 1 and World 3, although those are very, very distant from us and have little direct influence on us. But then the galactic world of World 6, our galaxy, does influence us, as does the sun and the planets above us, as well as the Moon and the Earth themselves. We reside on the surface of the Earth, but we are nevertheless under the influence and under the laws, the universal laws of the Earth. And then, of course, the Moon. Another important point in the fourth way cosmology is that in this scheme, where all of these energies, the ray of creation is like an enormous engine, and energies of all different kinds are passing constantly up and down and back and forth in this ray of creation. And human beings are a very special kind of receiving and transmitting device. We not only receive influences from the worlds above us, and in the case of the Moon, a world below us, but we also transmit a certain energy. And as we'll see later, this has to do with consciousness in particular, and what it means for consciousness to be asleep or to be dormant. And what might happen, what might change as consciousness begins to realize itself and become more aware of itself as pure consciousness. So this is a slightly different diagram, and it's just meant to show, here we are, human beings, we're in the very middle of this circle. In this case, there are two circles, one to depict the influences coming from our galaxy. Now, we know that there are the 12 signs of the zodiac, and these are used in astrology, and that's very popular. According to the fourth way, those influences are very small because they're so far away. And this is why you see in astrology and all the astrological signs and such, it's very vague. It's usually very general. They can be applied to almost anyone at any time. But people like this idea that, this is my sign and this is what's going to happen to me and so on. But really, you could just toss them in a hat and pick them all out and apply them to the different signs. So that's not to dismiss the idea of the influence of the galaxies. It's just to say, according to the fourth way, those influences are so far from us that it's hard to be definitive about how in fact they affect us. And the same is true to a certain extent about the sun. So inside you see the outer circle is the darker circle representing the influences that come to us from the sun. Now these come in the form of light, of course, and heat. Also, those are the rays of the sun and how they reach us, but they also bring, there are solar flares, there's radiation coming from the sun, there's a certain magnetism felt on the earth as a result of the sun's influence. There are many things science has been able to detect, and there are many that science is not aware of and cannot detect because the influences aren't visible, they're not measurable with our human instruments. But nevertheless, we as human beings are constantly under the influence of the galaxy and constantly under the influence of all these influences, transmissions, you could call them, coming from the sun. And human beings, again, are a very special kind of receiving and transmitting device. So are animals, so are plants, so are minerals. However, humans are a highly sophisticated form of receptor and transmitter. This all according to the fourth way cosmology. And here we've added another circle, and this is to show the planets and to say that on Earth we are also constantly under the influence of influences coming from our fellow planets. And this again affects the mineral kingdom, the animal kingdom, the human kingdom, the vegetable kingdom. And you'll notice by the moon, it says lunar cycles. The cycles of the moon, it's known that the cycles of the moon affect life on Earth. Plants react differently during new and full moons and quarter moons. The tides are the most obvious, one of the most obvious indicators of the influence of the moon and its magnetic pull on the surface of the Earth. And how it's as though it is pulling the skin of the Earth to itself, to the moon. It's feeding. This is the embryonic moon feeding through its tether to the Earth by means of magnetism. It's also the case that each of these planets, this goes into the idea of body types in the fourth way system. This was the origin, in fact, of the idea of personality types, which became, we'll go into that in another presentation, but if you look at the system of planetary types as presented nowadays, they don't point to their origin. What's the origin of these differences in these types? And they're often called personality types. But in fact, in the fourth way, they are regarded as essence types. And that means that each person's essence is influenced principally by one, and sometimes by two, a combination of two planets. And these have a strong effect on our physical makeup and on our psychological tendencies. And I'll talk more about that in just a minute. But here, just to conclude with this diagram, in the middle, human beings on Earth under the influence of galactic influences, under the effect of solar influences of many kinds that some we know, some we don't know, and then the planets. So we've gone from galactic to solar to planetary influences on mankind. The other way that the body type system in the fourth way works is that the theory is in the fourth way that the planets directly affect us by means of our endocrine system, the major glands in our body. And each of these major glands corresponds to a specific planet. So just to pick one, that the moon would have its corollary in the pancreas. Mercury would have its corollary influence in the thyroid gland, and so on. And the idea is that a planet affects a gland, and the gland affects a person's physiological and physical appearance, and as well as their psychological tendencies. This is more, I'm starting to talk now about body types. I didn't mean to do that, and we will do that another time. But just to show this idea, we're under the influence of these planets. What does that mean? In the fourth way, it's explained as the planets influence a gland, and each of us is under the predominant influence of a planet and its gland. And that's why people look different physically and act different psychologically. And there's a limited number of examples of this. Personality types, for example, talks about 9 types. And that's a misinterpretation of the Enneagram, which is 2 diagrams. It's 2 diagrams in one, the Enneagram. It's a circle and a triangle, and they're connected, but they're not one. So there aren't really 9 types. In the fourth way, there are 7, which correspond to the 6 interior planets and the sun. So, the 5 interior planets and the sun and the moon. So Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn are all inside of the asteroid belt in the solar system. And in addition to that, you have the moon, and then, of course, the sun itself. These are the main planetary influences and solar system influences on us. I mentioned how the planets and the glands affect us physiologically and psychologically. This diagram is meant to show that the psychological side of that as human beings, we unwittingly, and in most cases unbeknownst to us as to why, we develop certain attitudes. We're prone to making certain types of decisions in a different way than others. We have certain values, preferences, expectations, and beliefs. All of these develop in us psychologically as human beings. And this is just meant to show that in addition to us being affected by the galaxy, by the sun in its entirety as a solar system, by the planets, and by the endocrine glands physiologically, we have these psychological influences now which are acting on us all the time. Unbeknownst to us, the attitudes we have learned, the values we've been taught, the preferences we've developed. We have certain expectations about ourselves, about our life, about other people, about the world. We impose on our view of the world. We have beliefs. They can be religious, social, cultural, political, any number of things. These psychological influences are constantly swirling around us, you might say, in our head. And they're affecting our behavior, our choices, our decisions. And they are no less impactful than these large influences coming from outside of the earth. And the reason is because they're so much closer to us. They're not as big, they aren't as powerful, but they're so much closer to us that our attitudes and preferences and beliefs do go a long way in affecting how we see the world and how we respond to the world. And this diagram I put this quote from Peter Ouspensky because he says it so succinctly. I'll just read it. Roughly speaking, man's situation is this. He is a machine, and he is governed by currents coming from the big machines which surround him. What are these big machines? All big events, wars, revolutions, civilizations, religion, science, art, inventions. All these things are producing different influences on man, and he lives under these influences. This is very interesting to consider because, again, unbeknownst to us, I mean, we're aware of all of these influences, but we're not aware of how they affect us and how they color our sense of I and how they determine our choices, influence our decisions, and in very many ways stimulate our behavior. And so it's worth just looking at all of these. These, what's also interesting is, in effect, these are all man-made influences. Everything else we talked about so far comes from outside the Earth, the galaxy, the sun, the solar system, the planets, and even the glands. They are physiological. And although they do affect us psychologically, these influences you're looking at in red are all man-made. And yet they are huge. They affect us every day in many different ways all around the planet. And when there's a big invention, it has a big effect. When the telegraph came, when the steam engine came, when the radio came, when trains came, and then airplanes, and then television, computers, now smartphones. All of these are big inventions in science and technology that have an effect on us. The news carries a large weight in terms of people wake up every day and absorb, digest, consume large amounts of news, which they just believe anything they read, and it colors their outlook. Family and tradition is a big thing. How we're raised, what kind of traditions we grew up with. The weather where we grew up that affected our essence has a large effect on us. Certainly wars and revolutions, as Ouspensky said. Religion, different types of religion, different philosophical beliefs, the arts, politics, obviously, our race, our culture, all of these are showering on us and onto us and around us every day, all year, and determining our actions. And when you put this whole mix together, and you see the celestial and planetary and solar influences acting on us, then our behavior being governed by not only our glandular makeup, but by all of these influences on us, and then in turn our psychological outlook, as was mentioned earlier, our attitudes and preferences and values. Now we see that this is why the system says human beings are stimulus response machines. All of these influences are stimuli acting on us, pressing on us, pushing our buttons every day, and then we respond. And we respond largely according to our body type. And in what the system also calls center of gravity, meaning which of the four centers is predominant in us. Those also play a large factor in how we absorb, how we receive, how we act as a receptor, and then similarly, how we transmit or retransmit these influences that we receive. And this is also interesting to consider now in the 21st century. In addition to all that's already been described, there is now circling the Earth, just in the upper regions of the atmosphere and slightly beyond our atmosphere in some instances, tens of thousands of man-made satellites. And these are almost like little man-made planets. And they're circling the globe, they're circling the Earth all day, every day. And they're beaming down electronic signals. Some, of course, are taking pictures, but many, if not most, are beaming down some kind of electronic signal. And then down on the Earth, the other circle here showed in the red dot closer to the middle, is an enormous global infrastructure that allows for the conductivity of electronic instruments in a way unheard of until the late 20th century and early 21st century. And that includes the internet and the Wi-Fi networks and all of our computers and particularly our smartphones now. When you stop and think about the extent to which we're being influenced by these and how the satellites out in the atmosphere are affecting it and enabling it, you might say, and then all of these technological tools we use and carry with us. And this is enabling us to be a different kind of receptor and transmitter than ever before in history. And this is really an enormous invention, what Ouspensky would call an enormous invention that has an influence on us. And you can also think of it when we each carry a phone, a smartphone. We're like an electronic ground for all these electronic transmissions beaming around the Earth. And so there are now billions of electronic grounds, and we're walking around the Earth with them, enabling this communication network to feed on itself and influence us. And one of the things it's doing is this electronic infrastructure and transmission is fueling identification in new ways. It's enabling identification and the feeling of identity to manifest in new ways. And in the process, it's creating more conflict. It's enabling more conflict. And you see more negativity and more, conflict is the best word, really. And something else to keep in mind when looking at these is all of these influences, when you stop and think about it, they're invisible to us. We are not aware of them until we stop and think about them, and rarely do we think about all of these acting in conjunction at once on every human being every day. This is just a final look at the entire diagram as I've portrayed it, without just all in black, just to show, just to give you a chance to stop and maybe pause the video at some point, or if you watch it again, and consider this is how small we are, how much we are, the extent to which we're surrounded by influences that act on us, and in many cases unbeknownst to us in terms of what the effect is that they're really having on us. The main value of knowing this and thinking in these terms is simply to realize you can't really understand our life here on Earth without understanding how we're connected to the solar system, how we're connected to the galaxy, how we're connected to worlds and dimensions beyond the galaxy, and within our array of creation, and potentially in multiple rays of creation that we don't know about, can't detect.